So, Vanity Fair. There are notes over there. Did you grab something on the way in? Here goes. So we've been in there for 3 weeks because it's a long section. It's also one of the best sections of the book. But as we go through, you'll find other sections that you really like because we still have buy-ins, we have Doubting Castle, we have the Celestial City. There's all kinds of things that are still coming up that will be really interesting. But as we finish up Vanity Fair, what we're going to finish up is with the jury today, talking about the jury, the decisions, and then what happens. So let's go ahead and talk about Vanity Fair and do a quick review because it's been a while. What do you guys remember about Vanity Fair? What stuck out to you? What's meant something to you?
Talk about the only rule of the fair is you have to participate, you have to buy something.
Right. That's always the most important, right? There's only one thing in this fair that's absolutely required, and that's you do business in Vanity Fair. Everybody has to be a participant. If you're not a participant, then you're a heretic. Okay? But what is Vanity Fair? Let's talk about that. What is vanity? Do you guys remember? Chasing the wind. So what is vanity all about? And what is this fair meant to do?
To get you to pursue things that ultimately don't have lasting significance.
Right. Right. That's the whole town of Vanity. Now, why does that make sense? Like, what does that do for us? Why is this the scheme? Remember, Beelzebub is the prince of this town. Why would that work?
Well, it appeals to our sin and keeps us busy with everything except Jesus.
Good. Now, why does that work for Pilgrims?
They're trying to get to the Celestial City, but if you can get caught up in the rat race of Vanity Fair, you stop making forward progress.
Right, and you give it up.
And you will lose town.
So you have Apollyon who comes in and tries to destroy you on the spot using flaming arrows of temptation and everything else. And then there's Vanity Fair, which is more the end around. How can I convince you? How can I convince you to stop running? Right? There's a difference between I'm going to end you versus I'm just going to convince you to end you. And that's really the big difference, right?
Kind of like the soils, where the weeds and the thorns finally grow up and choke you out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot like that. And we'll see some of those things as we keep going too. But that's the idea of just Vanity Fair is they set this town up knowing where the Pilgrims were going to go, knowing the things that they're going to be challenged with to stop you in your tracks. Or rather, to get you to stop you in your tracks. So they're effective. The saints went in. Remember, they were wearing different clothing. They had different speech. Sorry, this is no problem. Can you check? Thank you. Okay. Cool. I'll try not to spit. So they come to this town. They have different clothing. They have different speech. They have all kinds of different things that that make them just different. Right? And the town at first was kind of like, these guys are weird. And then as they started going, they started saying, these guys are different. And then finally the question came out, if you're not going to buy any of our stuff, then what will you buy? And Christian said, we only buy the truth. And that's what got the town all riled up, remember? Because what makes the town struggle with that statement? When they have everything from murder to families. They will sell you church, they will sell you prostitutes, they will sell you anything they want to. There's this huge spectrum of anything under the sun that you can have. It's Solomon, it's Ecclesiastes, everything is available for purchase. You can have anything you want. You want religion? Have religion. We don't really care. You want family? Have a family. You want to be married and have a happy marriage? Have a happy marriage. We have that. That's just down on that town. You want it as an English style, an Italian style, you want this, you want that, we have everything. And yet these guys said, we only buy the truth, and that's what killed it for them. Why would that statement be so offensive to this town?
Since they're not the truth.
Hmm?
The way they're not the...
Because they don't have it?
Right.
And? Keep going with that.
It implies that they're believing a lie, or they're
Good.
They're wrong.
It implies that they're wrong, and also implies that This is probably the thing that they hate the most. In Vanity Fair, your goal is to lose yourself. It's to imagine the world as other than it is. It's to create your little bubble, right? I can create my world. I can say that if I have a nice white picket fence, my kids are all growing up, they're going to college, everybody's happy, I've got this wonderful life, right? What have I created in my life by doing that? Control. I have my own little bubble. I have my own reality. I have my own system for seeing the world. This is the way everything is, and everything's happy. Yay, I'm good. And then here comes somebody that comes in and says, you know what, I only want the truth. Well, not only are you saying that I don't have it, not only are you saying that what I have is wrong, I'm also saying that there's something more that I don't really want to know about. I like my bubble. I like creating this little world where everything is a zero-sum game, right? I like having the conservation of mass and energy, two greatest principles in the world, and then Einstein came and blew it. So you have these two principles that say, if I start with this much mass, I end with this much mass, right? If you're an engineer, that makes sense. If you're not, that's probably stupid. But the whole point being that I have a system that works. I have it all put together. I like it. And now you're coming in and telling me that there's something more that I have to take into account, something I don't really want to deal with, something I'd really rather ignore. I got two choices at that point. What are the two choices? It's like the Gospel of John. You're always faced with two choices. What are those two choices?
You either repent or ignore it.
Ignore it, though, you either have to repent and follow it, or I have to ignore it. But ignore it means doing what? Getting rid of it. Those are my two choices. Because remember in John 1, right? When the light came into the world, John 3, okay. When the light came into the world, men saw the light, and they did what?
Rejected it.
More than rejected it. They ran from it. They ran from it. You can either come to the light so that you can see your deeds are pure, or you run away from the light because you don't want to be exposed. But there is no just standing there and admiring the light. John is a black and white book. It's always for or against. It's always to or away. Right? Nicodemus was bid, either come to me or leave. But don't just stand there and tell me I'm a good teacher. Right? So here's Vanity Fair. That's exactly what happens with Christian and faithful coming in. They preach a message that says there's something more than this life that you guys aren't dealing with, and that was completely offensive. We cannot have that. You cannot come into this world and tell us there's anything more than the bubble that we're trying to create. We have everything under the sun to pick from, and you're trying to tell us there's something that this town does not have that's important? I can't have that. I just can't have that. And so they start to beat them, and they accuse them of wrong, and they put them in a cage. And then we had that weird scene where when they put them in the cage and treated them incorrectly, the men of the fair started saying, well, you know what, they haven't actually done anything wrong. Maybe we should, treat them justly. And that made everybody even angrier, because then they started fighting with each other, while our two pilgrims sat there in the cage doing absolutely nothing, right? And now it's because these men know that there's bigger things, and yet they're fighting with each other to stop it from being revealed. And then they're brought in trial, that's what we talked about last time. They were brought before Lord Hategood. And then we had the three things that Bunyan really highlights in terms of persecution. Do you remember who they were? Envy. Superstition. And pick-think, right? And what was superstition? Because that's the one, especially on Easter and Christmas, that's when our superstitions come out. It was very religious, very traditional, right? I do this. It's an overemphasis on a certain pattern. It's an overemphasis on ritual. It's a desire to make sure that we have we're doing the right things, right? And as you can see where it comes from now, it's baseball season, so you watch this every time, where every pitch comes out, they have to step out of the batter box, readjust their gloves, tap twice on their foot, right? Grab their crotch a couple times, look over at the coach, and it's every time.
Don't step on the first base.
Don't step on the first base line. That's right. There's certain things you never do, right? You'll see them actually running in from the outfield, and they'll hop over the line, right? Why? It's this overemphasis. If I do this, then I can get something. If I can just make sure I do all the right things or don't do certain things, I ensure myself good luck. I'll hit the next ball. I won't guarantee your percentages never change, but that's not the point. So that was superstition. That's where it becomes now. At that time, it was more, I have to have the certain liturgy. I have to sing the song this way. At Easter time, we have to do this, this, and this. Okay? So that was superstition. So envy hated him because here is a guy who's happy, faithful, and yet he's not following the common book of prayer. Then superstition comes in and says, he says that our worship, even though we're all doing the right thing, he says that that's not what God wants. What? And then pickthank comes in. Now, what was pickthank? He's a kiss up. That's the nice term. There's a lot more. If you surf the internet, you can get a lot more descriptive and humorous terms. He's the yes man. He's the king is calling and he wants a witness against this guy. I would love to do that, king, just for you because I love you so much. Do you love me? I hope you love me because I love you. That's the kind of guy he is. And so he'll tell you whatever you want to hear because that's his job. And so as Bunyan looks at this, envy, superstition, and kiss-ups are the ones that will cause persecution. Remember, pickthank doesn't care about faithful. He doesn't care about the religion. He doesn't care about anything. All he cares about is making sure he gets his own. Right? That's why you guys are going to like buy-ins, because buy-ins is all about the same thing. Okay? So those three, remember, they all witness against him. And then what happened to the judge? The judge said, all right, let's hear the defense. Right? What happened with the judge at that point? We had the oath. If you guys remember the oath.
Oh, yeah.
Or the unnecessary oath. Yeah. Oops. Give the man an oath. Okay. I didn't get a hump out of that guy. So Judge Haygood hears these witnesses, and then what does he immediately do? He declares the sentence. He declares them guilty. There was no defense. There was no cross-examination. He was just immediately declared guilty. Faithful is guilty because, well, we've heard enough testimony. That's all we needed, right? And then the judge proceeds to, remember now, just before that though, Faithful gives his defense. And what did Faithful do with that defense? And this is instructive as we look at this suffering, as we look at the persecution. What did Faithful do with that suffering? Did he make up 1,000 excuses? Did he point out every last detail that they got wrong? Did he try to cast the witnesses in the proper light to make sure that their character was impinged and their testimony was therefore nullified? Did he look for loopholes? Did he try to appeal to the jury?
He didn't. In some ways, he just said, "You're right," and
yeah.
I can't, change. I'm staying here.
Right. Exactly. That's just what he did. He just stood up and said, what these guys said is, here's what I said. I said that if you're against God, then if your worship is not for God, then God doesn't accept it. If you don't uphold the things in the Bible, then God doesn't accept that either. And if you're against God, then I'm against you. I can't do anything else. That was his defense. No clever words, no loopholes, nothing magical. He just stood up for what he believed. And he summarized it, and he said it. And then we finished off last week with Judge Hakegood, Lord Hakegood. And remember, Lord Hakegood was based on all the different judges that Bunyan had to stand before in his 13 years of prison and in a justice system. All these guys that would walk out and say, "Do you recant?" And he said, "No, I can't recant." And they said, "Back to the jury, back to the prison with you." Remember, he was supposed to be in prison for 3 months, and he ended up being in prison for 12 years, right? And they kept asking him, will you do something different? And the problem was that all the judges that he was standing before were upheld by the Anglican Church. So when he came out and they said, will you start teaching the common book of prayer? Will you stop preaching? He kept saying, I'm only going to preach what I'm going to preach. And they kept sending him back to prison because they weren't interested in justice. They weren't interested in right and wrong. They were interested in, do you agree with the church? And so Bunyan just kept buying his own ticket back to prison, right? So Judge Hakegood, realistically, Bunyan probably had a couple faces in his mind as he wrote about him. It's a common aspect for him. So Judge Hakegood gives us a few different precedents, right? The precedents were Pharaoh the Great when he killed off the Jews. Nebuchadnezzar. So there's, or if you want to go by movies, was there Prince of Egypt? If you want Moses. Rack, Shack, and Benny, if you want VeggieTales. Nebuchadnezzar the Great, requiring everybody to worship the statue, or otherwise you end up in the fiery furnace. And then there's Darius, who threw Daniel into the lion's den. And I'm pretty sure that's another VeggieTales, but I actually haven't seen that one. So, what was kind of the point of all those precedents? Do you remember? And I know this is right at the end of where we finished off last week. So, since most of you kind of just ditched class and skipped out early.
Oh, that's why I don't remember.
Oh, is that why we don't remember? It was kind of funny because last week, between greeters and choir and everything else, it went from this to like 4 people. All right, let's pray and finish up, shall we? So, it was kind of funny. So yeah, Friday was senior ditch day at our Avho. So it's kind of funny. Aiden was making all these plans, but he already planned a college tour. So he was already got an excused absence. And he's like, what? I have an excused absence on ditch day? So all day long, all I got was the updates of which kids actually went to school for which classes because they had to for an attendance grade. And whatever. That's on video. Aiden is totally innocent. He didn't do anything wrong. All right, so he calls a jury and says, let me tell you these precedents. So we had Pharaoh the Great, and Pharaoh killed off all of the infants because the Jews were getting too strong, and there was a threat that the Jews could possibly take over the Egyptians should they want to, because God had blessed them, there were more numbers, and so Pharaoh feels the need to kill off all the infants to try to stem the tide. Right? And so all of these precedents, so we have to kind of think about why is these being brought in as a precedent that affected the outcome against faithful. And that's the harder one. So Pharaoh kills off the infants. Nebuchadnezzar says, worship this statue, which in all likelihood was a statue of him. Come and worship the statue, otherwise you'll be thrown into the fiery furnace. And finally, Darius passes a law that says you can only worship me. I'm summarizing. Only worship me. You can't pray to any other gods. Otherwise, you'll be thrown into the lion's den. Okay? So what is the kind of the overarching theme across all 3 of those?
Concern for self on the part of the king.
Almost. It was centered around them. So that's important. It is centered around the king. But you have to go back, right? This isn't democratic, independent America. This is Medes and Persians. Right? This is Egypt. What did the monarch mean to the people?
Superiority of the state above all.
The state and what was wrapped up in the state in those times, and every other time except ours. Religion, state, they all wound up together. It wasn't until the United States where religion and this whole idea of church and state. Before that, there was no debate because there was no difference. It was all wrapped up together. God bless the king, right? God save the queen. That's the name of your anthem. God save the queen. It's all in there, right? And even in America, it was never meant to be as stark as we try to make it. They saw it as just slightly different. Now in the 20th century, 21st century, of course, we try to make it a black and white difference. That's not the case. So when these guys are all talking about the Egyptians, when the Egyptians are talking about the Jews, when Nebuchadnezzar is talking about the statue, he's not only talking about the state, he's saying for the good of the state, you need to worship this God. For the good of our people, for the good of our culture, for the safety of our way of life, this is what we need to do. We got to get rid of the Jews. We got to worship the statue. We got to worship this. We got to make sure God is appeased. Those are the things that we have to do. If we want our lives to be happy, if we want our culture to be saved, if we want to save the way of life, we have to get rid of that element, or we have to do this to make sure the gods are happy. Does that make sense? That's the overarching theme. So as Judge Hakegood brings all these up, he says that the idea is, what can we do with faithful? If we on Vanity want to continue in the way of life, if we want to pursue happiness in our way, if we want to find the things that we like, there's only one choice here, people. We got to get rid of this guy. And that's the precedent. But what's nefarious about this whole scenario?
They don't tell what happened at the end of those three scenarios.
Of course they didn't. Selective use of scriptures. Now, what did you just say, though? Selective use of scriptures. Is this a secular town where everybody is totally against the gospel? The gospel.
No, they can use it in a way that benefits them.
That's the trouble. These aren't unbelievers. Well, they are unbelievers. They aren't necessarily non-professing. They're not trying to put a distance between them and the church. They love going to church. They love the gospel. They love their Bibles. They have all the apps on their iPad. They have all the reading plans. They've got the books on the shelves. That's what's frightening. Judge Hategood uses the Bible to defend why he should kill the Christians. That's what Bunyan is picturing. He's not picturing a godless society. He's not picturing a non-religious society. He's not picturing a state that's out to get Christians. He's picturing a world where they have a form of godliness but deny its power. They have something that looks biblical. They have something that looks Christian. They have something that looks God-honoring in their minds, as long as it's not based on truth. Selective use of truth. So like you point out, they don't want to use the rest of the story. They don't want to say what happened to Pharaoh after he killed the Israelites, dying in a Red Sea. He doesn't want to explain what happened in the fiery furnace when the three guys were actually not only saved, but acquitted in front of Nebuchadnezzar. And he doesn't want to say what happened to Daniel in the lion's den when all these hungry lions were actually just sitting there as pussycats getting their belly rubbed Daniel, thank you. Daniel just walks right out, right? That's what happens. God redeems, God shows that all those actions were wrong, and he does it by redeeming the people that were supposed to be tortured. Does that make sense? So, we don't see that part, but they are happy. Judge Hategood is very happy to go ahead and use all those things to his advantage. Right? And by doing so, what is he going to do to the jury? As a jury hears Judge Hategood saying, here's what the Bible says we ought to do. If they come up with a guilty verdict, what can they say about themselves?
We're doing God's work.
God's with us. I'm being biblical. I'm doing what's right. You see how subtle this is? You see how subtle it is to take the scriptures and twist them in such a way that gets you what you want, the way you want it? Okay? So when we think about persecution doesn't necessarily have to be, I'm a pagan who wants you to worship a Roman God and you're a Christian, so therefore I'm coming after you. Persecution, some of the worst persecutions of the Christian church have come from the church itself. Saul coming after David?
Well, Saul.
Paul.
Oh, that Saul. Yeah, Saul coming after that. But even in the Christian church, if we look at what the Catholics did as time went by, we can go through church history again sometime. The Christian church is some of the worst of the Christian church. Okay? All right. Then we're on page 39, if you're following along the notes. Then went the jury out, whose names were Mr. Blindman, Mr. No Good, Mr. Malice, Mr. Lovelust, Mr. Live Loose, Mr. Heady, Mr. High Mind, Mr. Enmity, Mr. Liar, Mr. Cruelty, Mr. Hate Light, and Mr. Implacable, who everyone gave in his private verdict against him among themselves, and afterwards unanimously concluded to bring him in guilty before the judge. All right, so like I said, this is one of the best scenes in the book because of the number of characters and the way that they describe things so perfectly. This is the mind of Bunyan, right? This is what God blessed him with, and he used it to full advantage. So let's go ahead and meet our jury. First, we have the foreman, who is Mr. Blindman. So basically what they're going through is each person of the jury, they're going to go say, what do you think? What's your verdict? He's going to issue it, and then he's going to make a statement. right? Because you're, as a jury, you're allowed to make a statement. So Mr. Blind Man is the first and foremost. He's a foreman. He leads the jury. And Mr. Blind Man, and so this is where we're going to go with this because it's kind of fun to do. Mr. Blind Man, where do you guys see that in Scripture? The blind leading the blind. And what does the blind man say? I see clearly that this man is a heretic. Nice. And this is who's leading this, okay? So he sees clearly, obviously, that this man is a complete heretic. Somewhat ironic. Paul David Tripp said, sin plays havoc with our spiritual vision. Although we're able to see the sin in others with specificity and clarity, we tend to be blind to our own. And the most dangerous aspect of this already dangerous condition is that spiritually blind people tend to be blind to their blindness. Okay. All right, next. Then there was Mr. No Good. Now, where do you think Bunyan's getting that from? Don't look at the notes, that's cheating. Romans 3. There is none good, not one. Okay, so we know that that's where he's kind of going with this, Romans 3. So therefore, if there's none good, not one, then what is this man all about on the jury? What does he want to do? Because what does faithful represent to Mr. No Good?
Condemnation.
Yeah, goodness. And I got to get rid of it. So what does he say? Away with such a fellow from the earth. Makes sense. All right, Mr. Malice. Now, what is malice? Let's start there. It is the intention to hurt, right? It usually is assigned with envy and jealousy. So, for example, in Ephesians 4, let all bitterness, wrath, anger, clamor, and evil speaking be put away with you with all malice. So bitterness, wrath, anger, clamor, just, frustration, and evil speaking are all associated with malice. Okay, so we get angry, so we start to want to do something with that person. Titus 3, for we ourselves were also once foolish, disobedient, deceived, serving various lusts and pleasures, living in malice and envy, hateful and hating one another. One of the hardest things in the church is to get people to live together in love. Not just live together, not just gather together, to come to this place every Sunday morning with the intention to love each other. Because we can suppress our malice for a while, but it's still there. We don't like that guy. I'm not going to talk to that guy. That guy did me wrong. That guy smells funny. You do all those kind of things, right? That's malice. I don't like that guy, and I really would prefer if he wasn't here. Okay? So Mr. Malice is here. Mr. Malice says, said Mr. Malice, for I hate the very looks of him. So he wants to just get rid of him. He wants he is so deep-seated his hatred. Yeah, because I hate him. He's terrible. He's wrong for this world, for this country. Okay, Mr. Lovelust. Okay, Lovelust is pretty easy. He likes to lust. But what does that mean?
A strong desire for something.
Good, but keep going.
Usually something bad.
Usually it's something bad. Biblically, lust is always bad. Lust isn't, actually, I don't think lust is ever put into a good term, right? I guess sometimes we have expression lust for life. Whatever. Anyways, Mr. Lovelust, what does he want to do? Well, he wants to fulfill the flesh all the time. He has an inordinate desire to fulfill his flesh. Ephesians 2 describes us that we were once among whom also we all once conducted ourselves in the lusts of our flesh, fulfilling the desires of our flesh, of the mind, and were by nature children of wrath, just as the others. So here's the problem with faithful. What does faithful come in with his garb and his talk? Self-control and holiness, right? Finding something besides fulfilling yourselves, having something bigger than yourself that's worth chasing after. Here he comes preaching this, and so what does that tell Mr. Lovelust? Well, I got to stop. And if you're Mr. Lovelust, you don't want to stop. There's so much in this world to take in. I got to get it all, right? For example, this quote, lust involves any strong desire, craving, or want that opposes the holy will and command of God. Lust perverts, twists, and defiles all that is good and beautiful, and this is particularly true with sexual or carnal lust. So it's all about myself. And this guy keeps saying there's something more than that. So Mr. Lovelust simply says, I could never endure him. Put him away from me. Why could I never endure him? Because he tells me that what I'm doing is wrong. I got to get rid of him. All these guys want to get rid of him. Mr. Live Loose, very closely related to Mr. Love Lust. But what's the difference between live loose and love lust? Think about this one for a second. Because these are all aspects of the carnal mind. And they're important to kind of see the difference in, not because we all want to have these classifications, but as we think about how these people react. How do we deal with different people in the world? How does their attitude, how do we deal with these kind of people? Bunyan's not pulling this out of the air. He's finding real people that have mentioned this.
I just wondered if love lust is more in the mind and live loose is acting it out.
Yeah, to a degree. Although love lust would probably be pretty active himself.
I would say love lust is more desirous, purposeful, intentional, going after something. And
okay.
Live loose is very casual, but very open to whatever comes.
Yeah, that's good. So love lust says, I'm going after this. I want my pleasure. I am pursuing my pleasure. I want to fulfill my pleasure. Mr. Live Loose says, there shouldn't be any holds put on us. Everybody should be able to live the way that they want to live, right? We shouldn't have anyone tell us what's right and wrong. We shouldn't have anyone tell us that this is good or bad. Everybody should be able to pursue anything. Love is love, right? That's all that matters. So, Mr. Live Loose. And so now here comes Faithful telling him, no, actually, there is something bigger than you. There is something that has a requirement on you. You are a subject in a much larger kingdom with a creator that demands a certain lifestyle. You cannot live any way you want to. You should live the way that God has told you to live. Do you see the problem? Do you see why Faithful is such a threat to Live Loose? He opposes everything that he wants, right? So Mr. Live Loose says, he would always be condemning my way. We have to get rid of him. We have to get rid of him. Mr. Heady. Heady's a little bit harder. The idea with Heady is something that goes quickly to the guy's head. So an external influence that was quick to go to your head, changing your mind, driving your actions. So to be heady was to be rash or reckless in your decision making. You're very impetuous in what you do. Proverbs condemn a quick-tempered man, for example. While Titus talks about the need for us in the end times to act soberly. So this is the opposite of acting soberly. This is quick decisions. I'm making them all. I'm ready to go. Done. Don't give me wisdom. I know what I'm doing. So his reaction, of course, before the words can even come out of his mouth, he's already calling to hang him. There's not even a consideration to the man, right? There's no consideration to what was said. Hang him. And then Mr. High Mind. Now, what do you think of Mr. High Mind? Where do you think that one goes? Intellectual ivory tower would be a good way to put it, right? This is a man who thinks that Christianity is simplistic. For fools, right? There's more than this to us. There's a lot more to this. These guys are just too simple in their gospel. Now, why does this matter, though? Remember, we talked about this town that is not irreligious. So we're not talking about just a secular professor talking about how creation doesn't make any sense. This is a religious man. So now, how does High Mind work with religion against Faithful?
The intellectual version of Christianity does not condone or is not consistent with Mr. Faithful.
Okay, so he has his own version of Christianity that's based on what?
His view of the world, his intellectualism.
His intellectualism. I can think through my own Bible. I can think through how I want it to be. Here's how we reinterpret Paul. Here's how we make the gospel this way. Here's how I take this idea from secular science and mix it into my Bible. Here's how I do all these things to create my own version of the Bible. Make sense? Thomas Jefferson did that. He took out everything in the Bible that he felt was inappropriate and miraculous. Marcion did it in the 1st century. He took out anything Jewish because he hated the Jews. People love to take the Bible and twist it to make sure it fits their way. And here comes Faithful saying, no, it's just, here's the Word of God, and if the Word of God says it, then I believe it, and that's it. He can't have that. He's Mr. High Mind. He doesn't like him. He's a Pharisee. He can't deal with these fundamentalist Christians. So he says he's nothing but a sorry scrub. Then there's Mr. Enmity. Mr. Enmity is the idea of actively opposing or hostility towards something, in this case, God. Romans 6 said, because the carnal mind is enmity against God, for it is not subject to the law. And so he says he wants, his heart riseth against faithful, of course. Then there's Mr. Liar, which is kind of funny. Mr. Liar says he is a rogue. So a rogue at the time was a scoundrel. He was a con artist. He was a man who would trick you out of your goods, right? He was a shyster. A charlatan, thanks. Okay. Anyways, so he was Ocean's 11, right? That was a rogue, and this is Mr. Liar telling you that he's a rogue. And then there's Mr. Cruelty. Sorry, I'm running out of time. I'm going too slow, anyways. Mr. Cruelty loves to cause pain in another. That's what they find their pleasure in it is weird. There's no mercy, so hanging is too good for him, said Mr. Cruelty. And then finally, Mr. Hate Light, because I hate it, I run from the light, John 3. Let us dispatch him out of the way, said Mr. Hate Light, so we never have to look at him again. A.W. Tozer said, a new decalogue has been adopted by some of our day, the first words of which reads, thou shalt not disagree. And a new set of Beatitudes, too, which begins, blessed are they that tolerate everything, for they shall not be made accountable for anything. It is now the accepted thing to talk over religious differences in public with the understanding that no one will try to convert another or point out errors in his belief. Imagine Moses agreeing to take the part in a panel discussion with Israel over the golden calf, or Elijah engaging in a gentlemanly dialogue with the prophets of Baal, or try to picture Jesus seeking a meeting of minds with the Pharisees to iron out differences. The blessing of God is promised to the peacemaker, but the religious negotiator had better watch his step. Darkness and light can never be brought together by talk. Some things are not negotiable. Mr. Implacable was an unmerciful man. He can never be pleased. He is implacable. He said, might I have all the world given to me, I could not be reconciled to him. Therefore, let us forthwith bring him guilty of death. So that's our jury. They are really impressive, as you can imagine. So they did. Therefore, he was presently condemned to be had from the place where he was to the place from whence he came, and there be put to the most cruel death that could be invented. Now, what has he done wrong? He's being given the death sentence. What is the crime?
According to God's law or according to the town?
According to the town, he's a traitor and a heretic. He hasn't done anything, right?
Stands for truth.
He stands for truth. He has not tried to convert the town. He has not even sat there in the town square trying to preach and cause problems. He has not tried to overturn governments. He has not tried to pass legislation. He has not tried to do anything of that kind of... He hasn't really... He interacted with the people of the town, talking to them about truth, but he did not try to change the town. He accepted the town for what it is. It is vanity, and he's not going to change it. What he is going to do is conduct himself in holiness through it, witnessing to the true light. That was his only crime. Okay, and that's important, because what we don't want to see is he's getting, that I can go cause all sorts of problems, jumping into, accusing the homosexuals of this and accusing this, I'm going to stand on the line and just make all this, protests and everything else, and then wonder why I have backlash. He didn't do any of that. And yet there's backlash. Okay? He was undeserving, and yet that's what happened to him. They therefore brought him out to do with him according to their law, not God's law, but their law. And first they scourged him, then they buffeted him, and they lanced his flesh with knives. After that they stoned him with stones, then pricked him with their swords, and last of all they burned him to ashes at the stake. Thus came faithful to his end. Now, if you had to read that list, what do you think that you would find all those things? They scourged him, they buffeted him, they lanced him, they stoned him, they pricked him with their swords, and they burned him at the stake. Does that sound at all familiar? If you had to guess which two books Bunyan had in prison, what would they be?
Bible and Fox's Book of Martyrs.
Right? They scourged him, they buffeted him, and then they lanced him with flesh. What happened to Jesus? They beat him silly. Then they put him on the cross, and what was the last thing they did? They stabbed him in the side. Right? Which is what his witness was to Philip. Thomas. The other Thomas. After that, they stoned him with stones, they pricked him with swords, and last of all, they burned him at the stake. Fox's Book of Martyrs. Right? So what Bunyan is saying is, for faithful is all of his work. He is like Jesus in that he's beaten, and then he's burned at the stake like all his faithful martyrs. That's what Bunyan's picturing. Faithful was faithful. He stayed with it. He refused to give in when the chips were against him. He remained, and that's what he got. Now, that's what he got from a human end. Now let's go to the next paragraph. Now I saw, this is Bunyan as a narrator, now I saw that there stood behind the multitude a chariot and a couple of horses waiting for faithful. So as the crowd goes around him to watch him burn at the stake, over in the distance is a chariot. Now who rode chariots?
You have angel that took Elijah.
Right.
And then chariot.
Right. So when Elijah got picked up in a chariot, why was that special?
Well, he didn't necessarily get picked up in a chariot. The chariots came by.
Okay.
Assigned royalty, so
Yeah. So who got to ride in the chariot? Who's if you went into battle and there's somebody in a chariot, who was it? It was somebody important. It was the head of the chief. It was the head of the guard, or it was the king himself. It wasn't just a foot soldier. They all didn't get chariot rides, right? It was the king. So when you have the idea of this chariot standing by, this is victory. This is the king sending his private entourage, right? This is the caravan of black SUVs coming. I guess it doesn't really work as well, does it? But this is a chariot sent from God, sitting there with horses waiting for faithful, who, so soon as his adversaries had dispatched him, was taken up into it, and straightway he was carried up through the clouds with the sound of a trumpet, and the nearest way to the celestial gate. Why the sound of the trumpet? Victory. What happens when the king enters a room? When a person of royalty, there's an announcement. Everybody can stand. Here comes something official. Here comes something significant. And what happens is he's taken away into the clouds. There's a sound of a trumpet. And he's taken straight to heaven from there. So here's what happened on the earthly side. He was burned at the stake. Here's what happened on the heavenly side. He gets into a chariot sent by the king, and he goes straight to heaven, and there's a entourage of people watching. There's trumpets sounding his glorious entry. Can you see the difference between the two, the stark difference between what God saw as victory and what the world saw as defeat? Right? Now, why? But as for Christian, he had some respite and was remanded back to prison. So he there remained for a space, but he that overrules all things, having the power of their rage in his own hand, so wrought it about that Christian for that time escaped them and went his way. Okay. Now, there's two things you want to bring up. First of all, who got the better end of that deal? Faithful or Christian?
Faithful.
Why?
Live as Christ.
Okay. What was that?
He skipped straight to heaven. You went straight to be in the presence of Christ.
Right. Whereas Christian,
That's the labor of love.
yeah. So one was short and intense, but he's done. No more struggle. No more challenges. No more failures. No more looking at yourself and realizing, oh, I shouldn't have done that. No more, oh, why did I say that? No more, oh, how could I have thought that? No more looking at the world and saying, what do you mean that person fell away? What do you mean that person has cancer? The sweetest person in the world is now is dying. Why are they in pain? Why are these people in pain? Why is the world such a bad place? He's done. Faithful is in heaven. He's just seeing perfect, glorious fellowship. Christian has to keep enduring this. He has to continue to suffer for a while longer. Okay? So you ask which one is. Now, the harder question, of course, is, do you believe that? I know that's the right answer. What's your answer? Do you really think that if you were to die today, it would be better? Would you really see dying at the stake, not to minimize the fact that, that's painful, that hurts, everything about it is tough, but would you see that as a true blessing? Would you see entrance today as a true blessing? Especially those of us with kids watching it and saying, I'm not going to see my kid get married, I'm not going to see grandkids, I'm not going to see all these things. Is that still a blessing? I'm not saying it's easy. I'm saying it's a difficult condition. Mike?
I just keep thinking, I believe, Lord, help my unbelief.
Right. Do I have my valuation system correct? Right? And it isn't to say that this world is nothing. Don't get me wrong. All those things are blessings just to hear kids grow up and everything else. So I'm not trying to minimize that. I am trying to say, if God came and got you right now, would you be disappointed? That's the question. Next question. Christians put back into his cage. He that overrules the wrath of everyone, having the wrath in their hands, he calms it for a while. Now that they've dispatched faithful, they're kind of sedated. They've satisfied their lust for death. And so now they're kind of pushed back. Christian's sat in his cage. And now Christian, all of a sudden, the door opens and Christian escapes. Is that fair?
That's how God's decreed it's fair.
Okay. Is it right? Did Christian do the right thing by escaping? What should Christian have done? It's a good question Bunyan's presenting. Faithful died at the stake. Christian escapes.
The same God that orchestrated his capture and jail sentence is the same God that opened the doors.
Okay, so the fact that the door opens and there's a way of escape is ordained by God.
So
But
Peter escapes from prison, goes back to believers. Paul, there's an earthquake, and we're all still here.
Yeah, he was also dropped by a basket, right? He had the whole thing in Ephesus where they were yelling, "Great is Artemis," or whatever, and then he's squirreled away and escapes. What should they have done? Should Paul have sat there? Should Paul have taken a bigger role? Should Christian have said, I know the door is open, but I am here to present my faith, and I am going to stick it to these people to let them know exactly what they are and where God thinks of them?
Just like Stephen.
Just like Stephen. Should Christian have stayed in the cage to present his witness before these people? Was he wrong to escape?
I don't think he would have been wrong either way. I think he could have made either choice, and it would have been, and if he did it for the right godly reasons, it would have been okay.
At the same time, faithful just went to death at the stake. Should Christian have? It's a great question, right? It was one the first century church actually had to deal with a lot more than we do. The persecution of the saints was one where what happens to the people that recant? And then later repent. What do you deal with those guys? Okay? We'll do church history some other time. The point here that Bunyan's trying to make is faithful went to the stake. He was faithful with what God brought him. He was brought to the court. When he was brought to the court, he stood. He stood faithful. He witnessed. He remained true to his calling.
Yeah, we never heard Christians speak throughout the whole trial.
Exactly. Only faithful did. Because faithful was brought to the... Christian was left in the cage. Faithful was brought to court. Now it's Christian's time to bring to court, but the door opens and he escapes. So, did Faithful and Christian do something different? Faithful didn't have a choice. Faithful was brought to court. He dealt with it. He honestly dealt with the way that who he was, the way that God had him, and the situation that God had him, and he remained faithful. Christian doesn't have the same situation. The door is flung open. So Christian takes the opportunity.
So we don't make the assumption that he weaseled out of it somehow.
No. It says here that he who had the power over all things wrought about it that Christian for the time escaped them. So it wasn't that he was conniving. It wasn't that Christian was just looking for a way of escape. God allowed him to go free. And so the situation's different. So is Christian less faithful than faithful? No, not necessarily. The situation is different.
Situations that God has ordained.
Right. And that's important to understand. Persecution by itself is not equal to holiness. There is no merit in suffering for suffering's sake. There is no merit in persecution for persecution's sake. That also happened in the first century church, where Christians were walking into persecution saying, persecute me. There was no holiness. There's no added venture or gain from doing so. For Christians just to sit there while the door is open and say, I'm not going to take it, I'm going to stand here until somebody comes and persecutes me, that's not faithful, guys. To go where God leads you is faithful. Faithful had no choice. Where God led him was up to that court. Where God led Christian is out that door. And you're going to see Christian's going to deal with a lot more garbage still to come. And he's going to struggle. And he's going to be in pain. And at one point he's going to consider suicide. Okay? So just because he got out of this jail doesn't mean his days were just roses from here on out. Right? So Bunyan's taking a real good aspect to this. Faithful is faithful in the situation that he was in. Christian was faithful in the situation that he was in. And they were different. And they can be compared, but they're not the same. Does that make sense? It's kind of just it's an interesting check. So Christian saying, well, faithful, thou hast faithfully professed unto thy Lord, with whom thou shalt be blessed. When faithless ones with all their vain delights are crying out under hellish plights, sing, faithful, sing, and let thy name survive. For though they'd kill thee, thou art yet alive. John Newton said, faith upholds a Christian under all trials by assuring him that every painful dispensation is under the direction of his Lord. The chastisements are a token of his love, and the season, measure, and continuance of his sufferings are appointed by infinite wisdom and designed to work for his everlasting good. And that grace and strength shall be afforded him according to the needs. So Christian's going to continue on, and we're going to enjoy it. So I know it was a long section. There was a ton of stuff there, and it was spread out over 3 weeks. Any questions as we finish up? Vanity Fair. Okay. Next 2 weeks we're going to be in Buy-ins, meeting with Mr. Buy-ins, Mr. Money Love, Mr. Save All, and Mr. Hold the World. It's going to be a great section. You guys will like it. Another twisting of Scripture. But there's some hypothetical situations, okay, that we're going to talk about, and they're going to be good. Like, if a minister can get a bigger parish by becoming more religious, should he? And we're going to deal with that situation. And we're going to deal with Mr. Buy-ins. And he's from the town of Fair Speech. He's related to, of course, Mr. Fair Speech himself. But his grandfather was Mr. Two-Face. He rose both ways. Right? So we're going to look at a couple things like that. They're going to be real interesting. Again, compromising. That's going to be the big theme for the next couple chapters. And then we'll get into the river of God. And then we're going to get into Doubting Castle. A Bypass Meadow and then Doubting Castle. Okay, and those are good, rich sections. As you go through those things, though, what the big thing here is we get into Mr. Buy-ins, as we get into Bypass Meadow, and as we get into Doubting Castle. The big thing for us will be to be a little bit more reflective. Okay, now we're not talking about how the world treats Christians. It's now going to be what comes out of us. How do I compromise when I compromise? What happens when I compromise? What happens when I start to look for easier ways out? And this is going to happen because if you notice, this is the rough idea of Christian getting older. He's battling it out over and over. He's got more challenges, more things to deal with, more stuff he's got to go through. And so guess what happens as we get further in the book? Christian starts to get faced with more and more opportunities to compromise. Because when you've been battling it out, what happens? You're tired. I'm just tired. I'm worn down. I'm getting tired of dealing with the same garbage. I'm getting tired of not getting a return on my investment, so to speak. I'm getting tired of battling and losing and repenting and picking myself up. So I start going to start looking for opportunities to make things easier on myself. Looking for ways to justify myself. Looking for ways to give myself a blessing quickly, as opposed to waiting for God's timing in His end. Does that make sense? So we're going to start seeing. And then we're going to meet atheists. And we're going to meet little faith. And we're going to meet all these guys that are all representing different ways of compromise for us. And we've got to start getting more self-reflective with this. That's what Bunyan wants to see. He wants to see saints make it to the end by alerting you of things we have to watch for so we make it to the end. We've got the Vanity Fair. We can't lose ourselves in this world. Now we got to start dealing with compromise. Okay? Make sense?
With, going back to Mr. Highmind, but also kind of highlighting, in the church back then, there was no possibility of challenging and saying, Christian is just a layman. What does he know about truth or,
Absolutely. There's always the idea of this guy that he's just uneducated. He doesn't really know. And this is, if you go back to Spurgeon's own testimony, he kept going from church to church to church, and he finally finds a primitive Methodist, which I have no idea what primitive Methodists believe, but the fact that the word primitive is in it tells me that it's probably not considered to be pretty impressive. But he's in a primitive Methodist church. Some guy that Spurgeon describes as stupid gets up and he starts preaching, saying, if you believe it, come forth. He doesn't want anything from you but to believe. And for whatever reason, that's what got Spurgeon converted. He realized that it was really just a pretty simple equation. It didn't take a lot. And he had been in other churches where he'd been preached at in all kinds of ways. But yeah, the high mind says, I've got to have a certain aspect. We've had churches shut down. We've had churches where pastors have come out of here or been related to coming out of masters, where the pastor would literally preach a seminary study. It would be high, exalted, very complicated, faithful, true exposition, but ridiculously complicated. And we find the church falls apart because people aren't growing. They don't get it. It's too much. You drifted from the true gospel. The simplicity of the gospel is lost in the high theology. So that can take a lot of different forms. It's true.